I'll try. All right. Should we start? Or should we wait for another couple of minutes? Sarah? Okay, well, let's start then.
No, we can start now. Really, I think we should start on time. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and
seems Sarah's frozen there.
Yes.
1 second.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar on Anglo-European Intelligence Cooperation, Britain in Europe and Europe in Britain. So my name is Sarah Leonard, and I'm Professor of International Security at the University of the West of England, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Hager Ben Jaffel, who's currently a research associate at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. So Hager will be presenting her book, and also, I suppose, put that in the context of the research she has been conducting over the last few years. And then our discussant, Professor Christian Kaunat from the University of South Wales, will say a few words, and I'm sure we'll probably have a few questions as well before we will open the floor for questions and answers. So Hager, as I said, is a research associate at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. She received her PhD in international relations at King's College London, and she's in the process of developing a new research agenda for the study of contemporary intelligence. And she's particularly interested in the practices of security professionals and what she calls the everyday life of intelligence. So absolutely fascinating. So in addition to the book that she will present, her work has been published in various journals, including International Political Sociology, European Security and Intelligence and National Security. So it's a great pleasure for us to have you here this afternoon to talk to us about such a fascinating topic. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sarah, and thank you also to the Jean Monnet Network on Counter-Terrorism for hosting this talk. Yes. Can we move to the next slide, please?
Yes, I'm trying to get back to it, but it has done something here and I don't know what or why. Sorry, what can you see? No.
I can see your desktop.
1 second. Okay, now it's back, but you can't see it anymore. Let me try sharing the screen again. And here and here. Okay, so now we are back.
Cool. Can you move to the next one, please? Yeah, perfect. So as Sarah told in the introduction, so this presentation is drawn from my monograph, which explores the actual and non-standing involvement of British police forces in daily European intelligence collaborations in the field of counterterrorism. So I think to begin with, I think it's worth recalling that fighting terrorism is key political and operational stake in Europe, which is usually resetted following terrorist attacks, as we have seen last year, for instance, in France, Britain, and Germany. And so in that context, police forces are at the core of the response to terrorism at home and abroad. And so the activities of police forces in combating terrorism through intelligence are no coincidence, and for two reasons. First, because of a change in the operational orientation of intelligence. So intelligence, which is no longer just about counter-espionage, has extended the scope of its targets to include counter-terrorism. Second, because intelligence, well, is part of the daily work of specialized police units that are involved in both counter-terrorism and intelligence. And so in the UK, the largest counter-terrorism and intelligence unit of the police service is located within the Metropolitan Police in London, which has also been assigning police liaison officers in European capital cities since the late 80s. And so in that sense, counter-terrorism, intelligence, and cooperation are, if you like, inseparable functions in police work, whereas alliances with continental partners have long been in development, as indicated, by the network of police liaison officers deployed in Europe. And so this empirical observation led me to argue, well, that British intelligence has indeed a European dimension. And so intelligence cooperation has conducted by police forces is a visible and revealing indication, if you like, of the entanglement between British services and their European counterparts, between Britain and Europe more broadly. However, and well, despite this preliminary empirical evidence, so the European dimension of British intelligence has been sidelined in intelligence studies. And this is also accentuated by past and ongoing political debates on Brexit that overstate the divide between Britain and Europe. And so my research has thus consisted in uncovering Anglo-European ties in intelligence by shifting away from some core assumptions in intelligence studies towards a sociological line that focuses on the human and practical dimensions of intelligence. And so in what follow, I will give particular emphasis to how I responded to the main research question raised in the book. How are British services involved in the European logic, and how do they work with continental partners? So I will briefly go through the literature and then explore how British intelligence is, well, in fact, embedded in European collaborations by looking at the everyday practices of police liaison officers. And I will conclude by addressing the implications of Brexit for European intelligence and security cooperation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what does the literature say about Anglo-European intelligence cooperation? Well, not much, which raises the question of why it has not been addressed properly. So in my view, this is the consequence of three dominant assumptions in the literature. So the first assumption deals with how relations between Britain, the United States, and Europe are broadly understood. So if you like, there is an overrepresentation of the United States in intelligence relations broadly conceived, which has affected the reading of the relations between Britain and Europe. And so existing literature has consistently situated Britain's relations with the United States as central, thereby sidelining Britain's European dimension. And so as a consequence, Britain cannot be seen as effectively embedded in Europe and intelligence relations accordingly. The second assumption concerns the way in which intelligence cooperation is accounted for. So cooperation is mostly grounded in threat-driven perspective. So for many scholars, the globalization of the terrorist threat has incentivized services to work together. So basically services join forces because they reply to the perception of threat. But that line of argument actually overlooks the actors and practices of intelligence as central forces making up intelligence. And so as a result, what and who constitutes Anglo-European cooperation is not taken into account. The third assumption is about the role of police forces in intelligence cooperation. So the police are not considered as key players in intelligence cooperation, mostly because intelligence cooperation remains a matter for intelligence services. Also because for one strand of the literature, the police do not do intelligence. So police forces, are not seen as being involved in intelligence. They are not seen as producing their own intelligence routine. That said, it is, in fact, possible to have a different understanding of the relations of British services with Europe if we adopt a conception of intelligence that focuses on the everyday of intelligence cooperation in terms of people and their practices. And this is where the sociology comes into play, and in particular, the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu. Next, please. All right, so Pierre Bourdieu, and I'm sure some of you have already heard of him, is a French sociologist who has written extensively on a variety of topics ranging from academia, culture, and bureaucracy, but who was never interested in intelligence. So therefore, Pierre Bourdieu is not one of the traditional authors in intelligence studies. So we can wonder then, why Bourdieu? So, because he helped us expand our understanding of intelligence by focusing on the analysis of social actors and practices behind intelligence. So if you like, with Pierre Bourdieu, we can open up intelligence and see the inside of intelligence. You can capture the multiplicity of actors of intelligence, their daily practices, but also their relations and struggles. In fact, you can get all the things that make up the everyday, the daily life of intelligence labor. So it's people, their life experiences, how they understand their roles, their feelings, alliances, disagreements, and so on. And so in other words, with a sociological approaches like this one, we can see and understand what and who makes Anglo-European intelligence relations alive. And so this research line is, well, strongly connected with a research method that gives primacy to ethnography fieldwork with ground level professionals. So for the purpose of my research, I conducted 60 interviews with liaison officers from British police forces and EU security agencies based in London, Paris, and The Hague. I basically researched, concrete manifestations of Anglo-European cooperation in daily routines, working relations, and also the broader social space in which these are embedded. And so from that point of view, a perspective inspired by the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu, well, it renders visible two dimensions that have been overlooked by intelligence studies, but which are central to my argument. First, it allows us to see that intelligence cooperation, well, is the bread and butter of police labor in Europe. Second, it also shows that police liaison officers and their practices, they take shape in a larger field of intelligence cooperation. So for Bourdieu, people and their practices are inseparable from the social context in which they are embedded, which he calls a field. So a field is like a big bubble, if you like, and I'll show you. Next, please. Thank you. So where are my notes here? So it's a bubble where people are linked to each other because they have specific interests at stake. And so interests take the form of symbolic and the material resources that generate struggles among people precisely because they're at stake. And so that means that a field, or a bubble if you like, is transversal and attract people beyond their institutional background and nationality. And so I'll give you now a concrete example of the field with intelligence cooperation. Next, please. Cool. So here, cooperation is understood as a playing field that is, well, not limited to the intelligence community, but is shaped by a multiplicity of actors who struggle over specific stakes. And so these struggles take place in both domestic and European arenas. So the first battle is played out at the domestic level between UK police and intelligence services involved in the fight against terrorism. So you have the MI5, the MI6, the CSQ, and the Metropolitan Police. So here my point is to say that services, well, they don't fight against the threat. They fight over resources pertaining to the fight against terrorism, which is a bit different. So here, I mean, counter-terrorism is, well, first and foremost, like a set of resources involving, well, activities, budget, and personnel for which services compete. And so these resources set what is at stake in this side of the field, which explain why services will fight for them. So remember that according to Bourdieu, a field binds people who have specific interests at stake. And so the fight against terrorism, well, is therefore a space of competition among services to take over resources, which trigger struggles to gain and accumulate these. And so as a consequence, some services have more resources than others to fight terrorism and are better positioned than others accordingly. So in other words, their position, their strength in the fight against terrorism are set through the amount of resources they accumulate. I mean, if you like, the more resources you have, the stronger you are. And so this battle has an impact on what happens at the European level. So why some services are more involved than others in European cooperation arrangement is explained, in fact, by their position at the domestic level. So the uneven distribution of resources affects the way services and the personnel interact with each other in Europe. And so this certainly explains why the Metropolitan Police is much more active than intelligence services in the sphere of liaison officers. Now I'll turn now to the European level and the sphere of liaison officers. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I said before, so intelligence cooperation is caught in two forms of struggle. So the second battle takes place at the European level among British and European liaison officers involved in intelligence cooperation. So here I focused on two groups of liaison officers, those who are based in European capital cities and those who are based at Europol. And so on that side of the field, actors are involved in struggles over the definition of cooperation. So if you like, they struggle to impose a vision of the best way of doing cooperation. And in Bourdieuian language, this is what we call symbolic struggles. So these struggles, in fact, have two implications in practice. So first, they have implications for how cooperation is structured. So broadly speaking, cooperation can be thought of as a set of channels for exchanging intelligence, and there are plenty of them. And so this multiplicity of channels means that players are in fact autonomous in deciding where and how to distribute intelligence. And as a consequence, intelligence exchange operates against a background of parallel and competing routes of communication. And so by extension, none of the players has a monopoly on relations with a foreign country, and no one centralizes cooperation. So liaison officers, if you like, are not a mandatory point of transit between two countries. They are very often bypassed. Second, these struggles have implications for how players position themselves in relation to each other. So these struggles, in fact, generate logics of distinction and strategies of positioning among liaison officers. So their concern, in fact, on the ground is to be seen and recognized by other players in order to make a place for themselves. And so here, the everyday work plays, in fact, a key role in how liaison officers internalize a specific understanding of intelligence cooperation. And so in being involved in cooperation on a daily basis, in acquiring experiences in crafting cooperation over time, liaison officers, in fact, incorporate and accumulate disposition, that is, ways of seeing and doing cooperation. And so to understand, in fact, how they position themselves, it is necessary to take a look at the disposition they acquire and therefore at what constitute their daily work. Next, please. So in the book, I focus on the daily routines of counter-terrorism and extremism liaison officers of the Metropolitan Police, who are deployed to the anti-terror coordinating unit in Paris. So I pay actually attention to the Anglo-French case because it clearly shows how the European dimension of British intelligence is embedded in the lived experiences of liaison officers. So they day-to-day practices are roughly divided between two major types of activities. So the first one is, well, operational work. So they spend a lot of time processing the flow of incoming and outgoing requests for information. So requests are usually submitted by, well, the Metropolitan Police, but also by other British police forces and French services. And so basically the process involves recording, assessing, prioritizing, and forwarding requests to the right recipient service, but also sending back responses to inquiries to the requesting services. The second activity is social networking. So they also spend a lot of time building and fostering ties with local counterparts through informal gatherings. And so building social relations, which may seem, insignificant, is of considerable importance to liaison officers. And that's what I call the significance of the insignificant, how small little things play an important role in day-to-day counterterrorism. And so these small little things can mean, for instance, acting as an insider, which means not going native, but adjusting to the local customs and way of living in the host country. So in the UK, it's, for instance, it's about going out for a beer in a pub, or in France, it's having a meal at a restaurant. And so these practices, in fact, enable British liaison officers to consolidate close relations with key partners over time, which have remained almost the same over the past 30 years. And so this way actually of doing cooperation gained during daily work, well, that enabled liaison officer to frame strategies of distinction vis-a-vis other players of cooperation, and in particular, liaison officers based in EU internal security agencies, such as Europol. So remember that, liaison officers, they are not the only show in town. I mean, they are in competition with other players. And so to be seen and recognized by their local counterparts, like for instance in Paris, they perform roles in order to distinguish the way they work from what other players do. And so what they do is that they would frame their role according to what they see as the most legitimate means of doing cooperation. So in other words, they claim, if you like, specific know-how and know-how to be that they have gained through their experiences in crafting cooperation. Next, please. So liaison officers, they understand and define their roles in three ways. So first of all, they play the role of diplomats in representing and acting on behalf of their home country. They also play a supportive role by facilitating the, if you like, the circulation of incoming and outgoing requests between home services and the local counterparts. So if you like switcher, they help orienting requests to the right recipient. And it's, in fact, it is precisely, how can I say that? Through everyday practices and social networking in particular, that they develop their own knowledge of who is who in the host country, and that they're therefore able to determine who is the most appropriate contact to place a demand to, for instance. Third, they also play a role in exchanging intelligence at speed. And actually I can follow up on what I said before, is that because they know who to contact, they claim to be able to process requests quickly and hence exchange intelligence at speed. And so, as I said, these strategies of distinctions enable these officers to position themselves in relation to other players, and in particular Europol. So the entry of Europol into the space of cooperation has indeed, if you like, disrupted the authority of liaison officers, which has remained almost uncontested until the mid-90s. And so this is where you find struggles over how cooperation should best be practiced, which I mentioned before. And so basically this space or field, if you like, of cooperation is split between two conceptions of cooperation. On the one hand, you have the traditional conception, which is defended by players who enter the space of cooperation first. So this dimension of intelligence cooperation is mostly invested by liaison officers based in European capital cities. So for them, bilateral cooperation is faster, more efficient and reliable than Europol, and for them, this is actually real policing. And so the operational criteria that make up this real policing involve everyday practices that are most valued by liaison officers, as I told you before. So being in direct contact with local counterparts, having a hands-on knowledge of the person in the host country, and so on. On the other hand, you have the modern conception of cooperation, which is defended by players who last entered the space of cooperation. And so that dimension of intelligence cooperation is mostly invested by EU internal security agencies such as ENDA personnel. And so in contrast to bilateral cooperation, Europol, for instance, highlights distinct operational criteria. So it provides, as it says, a one-stop shop facility where all parties are brought in one place, thereby enabling the swift exchange of intelligence between the agency and thousands of users through secure networks of communication. So that's for the field of intelligence cooperation. Now I will quickly conclude with Brexit. Next, please. Cool. So what does Brexit mean for counter-terrorism intelligence cooperation? To what extent does the political decision to leave the European Union bear on the practices of cooperation? So to answer these questions, well, I did not focus on intelligence only. I extended the analysis of intelligence towards its relationship with the political field. I also adopted a reflexive approach, looking back at what happened before Brexit and what that means for practices on the ground. So what can we see then? So first, we can see that Brexit is in fact embedded in the history of recurring negotiation of Britain's relations with the European Union. So Brexit is in fact tied to the British opt-out from Justice and Home Affairs that happened in 2014. And so, as you probably know, so the opt-out involved exiting some Justice and Home Affairs measures and then rejoining a set of selected measures after negotiation with the EU. So it's an in and out process, if you like. And so it was during this debate on the British opt-out from Justice and Home Affairs that I conducted interviews with liaison officers of the Metropolitan Police. And so what happened is that during our conversation, well, actually none of them referred to this debate. And in fact, this is no surprise because everyday cooperation on the ground operates according to operational rather than political criteria. And so political decisions, if you like, are not a concern for them. And so as I explained before, so I mean, the most immediate concern on the ground is to distinguish themselves from other players in order to survive, if you like, in a very competitive playing field. And so what is interesting to see also is that their strategies of distinction consist precisely in taking position against the bureaucracy and constraints of EU-driven arrangement. So they advocate operational criteria that involve, the subtleties and small little things of the daily job. So as I said before, such as acting as an insider, knowing the right people and so on. And I mean, more generally, their practices and relations are not about working with the EU. So it can be safely argued that, this dimension of intelligence cooperation will survive as we move in this post-Brexit context. In contrast, in fact, Brexit raises a higher stake for those British services bound to cooperation driven by the European Union. So if you have taken a look at the Brexit deal, you'll see that the agreement maintains the participation of UK law enforcement in a number of EU arrangements, such as Europol, joint investigation teams, and the exchange of criminal records. And so in looking backwards, it becomes possible to see that the retention of these measures is the outcome of struggles between security professionals and politicians during the opt-out from Justice and Home Affairs. As I said earlier, it's really important not to limit the analysis of intelligence alone, but to address its relationship with the political field. And so back in 2012, so the British executive, took the decision to withdraw from a set of GHA measures and plan to fall back to alternative cooperation arrangements, such as, bilateral and other ad hoc mechanisms that precede actually the introduction of EU measures. And so for police forces, this move has been experienced as a political interference into operational matters. So the executive decision resulted in an outcry of opposition among security professionals. So you had like senior officials from the National Crime Agency alongside, the British directors of EU security agency who have been quite vocal in pleading for the continuation of EU-led cooperation. And so to take position against political choices, they undertook a number of actions, to anticipate a change in operational activities with the European Union, and most importantly, to reflect their operational priorities to political decision makers. So to give you an example, for instance, what they did is to give evidence to parliamentary committees in charge of scrutinizing the government activities in security and European matters. So for instance, during the hearings, they would frame alternative options to EU cooperation as a problem. So for them, they're outdated, cumbersome, and unfit for operational necessities. And by contrast, EU measures enable them to exchange intelligence at speed and provide them, with sophisticated means of performing cooperation that no other mechanism can match. They're also, what they also did is they assessed and categorized EU measures in order to inform the government's position. And so in that regard, the late Association of Chief Police Officers, which is now the National Police Chief Council, well, they set up a list of measures that were vital to retain for day-to-day policing. So then what happened? Well, so in its decision to rejoin some elements of Justice and Home Affairs in 2014, So the British executive took into account, the demands of security professionals, including the list of measures I just mentioned. And so the list includes arrangement ranging from PNR, Europol, JITs, and ECRIS. Those various measures retain in the Brexit deal. So here you can see that the opt-out sheds light on the moves of British law enforcement against the background of disputes with politicians. And we basically see like a similar process in the context of the Brexit negotiations. Well, now with the deal, it now remains to be seen how it will be translated in practice within UK law enforcement, given that the details of the agreement have yet to be decided. But I'll leave this for another talk when I finish my new project on the implications of Brexit for UK law enforcement. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Excellent. Well, that was really very good in terms of timekeeping, but you you gave us really a lot to think about. So I'm sure that there will be questions, and perhaps notably on that point, you briefly touched upon it, but I'm sure that a few of us would be interested in hearing more about what you think is going to happen now, and whether those habits of having cooperated together actually will continue despite the political climate being a bit different now and perhaps not so serene, shall we say. So before we open the floor to everyone for questions, I guess that Christian may have some comments and perhaps some burning questions of his own. So Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hager. That was a great presentation. It was a very, very nice book. I read it and I've made my comments already public. So in that sense, it's quite well known that I very much liked the book, and I thought it was a really, really good book. And a very important one, like you pointed out at the beginning. It is quite curious how, in a sense, in the intelligence field, there's this perception hasn't really been very much going on with Europe, and that there's been a kind of a slight misrepresentation, perhaps, in terms of what's going on in the ground. I just wanted to kind of push you a little bit on some of the questions. One is notably on your definition of intelligence, right? Because you're kind of expanding the definition of intelligence. And of course, I guess there may be some people who might take slight issue with that and might say, oh yeah, but you're kind of mixing up law enforcement there with intelligence, kind of just to push a little bit how you would define and still justify that this is important. And then the second one is one thing that I think anybody who is kind of a little bit in the French sociological tradition probably gets that question, and that is, how do you define practices? It's a question that we ourselves have been getting quite regularly when we present, but I thought I'll also pose that question to you, because of course some thoughts in the profession would argue, well, you can't really distinguish between practices and discourses because practices are also discourses. So I'm just curious what your definition would be to kind of make that distinction more clearly. Personally, I also agree with you, so I'm just asking that out of curiosity more than anything else. And then the third and maybe last question before we then open the floor, because we also want to hear from the public, is a little bit about Brexit. I think we've heard, obviously, your views about Brexit, but what would be your assessment in terms of where we're heading? I mean, at the beginning of the Brexit negotiations, there was, in a sense, great ambition on the British side. It was still under Theresa May, a very comprehensive security deal. And even when Boris Johnson took over, there was still relatively big ambition in terms of security cooperation. And that ambition was stripped down to the bare bone just before we got the actual treaty, a treaty that hardly has any ambition at all, one might now suggest. So I just wondered whether you thought this is an indication of where the relationship is heading, or do you think this is one of those classic going up and down in the relationship between Britain and Europe, that at the moment we're on the downwards trend, but in a couple of years we might be at an upwards trend? Just wanted to hear your views on that. And I'll keep it to those questions and then we'll open the floor. In the meantime, I would like to tell everybody that if you have questions, you can already put them in the chat, and then we can come back to you in terms of asking your question.
Yes, thank you, Christian. If I may just add one, abuse my power of the chair to add one. As I was listening to you, the discussion about bringing Bourdieu to the study of security reminded me of the work of Didier Bigot. So I was wondering whether you are like building on his work or departing from it. If yes, in what way? So I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about that. But please, we are very keen to hear your answers to these few questions, and then I'll have a look at the chat box to see if there are more coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Christian, for these 3 burning questions. So I'll start with the first one, which is about the definition of intelligence and how I would define this notion. It's true that there's a lot of debate at the moment as to what counts as intelligence. And I do think the problem in the special intelligence study comes from the fact of the history of the discipline, which has been, as you know, which has been structured around the experiences of Anglo-American intelligence practices. So basically, when you read intelligence studies, the definition of intelligence actually fits the experiences of those very specific services. And so, and I think that was also the aim of the book, is to show that by looking at practices, by interrogating those who are claiming to do intelligence, well, therefore, you can have a much more expansive definition of intelligence. And I do think that intelligence is not, I think that the key research strategy is not to focus on the usual suspects, if you like, but to expand the analysis to those who are claiming competences over intelligence. And this is what, for instance, the police is doing. But it's also, you can also see other actors who are involved in so-called intelligence work. For instance, you have private security services, but you also have, for instance, actors who are not seen immediately as involved in intelligence. And I'll give you, for instance, the example of politicians. So politicians, obviously, they're not the primary intelligence, I would say, actors, but because they're involved in defining, contesting, or even funding, I would say, intelligence, because they are involved in doing something in relation to intelligence. Therefore, you can, I mean, I wouldn't say these are intelligence services, but you can see that they are part of this broader field of intelligence. So I think that the response to your question is obviously to look at the practices of those who are claiming competences, but also to look at the borders and at the relations between, I would say, the traditional actors with those non-traditional ones that are actually involved in defining intelligence through, I would say, contestation, definition, and so on. And if you want to have a much more, detailed response, you can take a look at my article in International Political Sociology. How would you define practice? That's a key question. So, well, as far as I'm concerned, I will kind of stick to the Bourdieuian definition. So practices are the everyday doing of social actors, what you do on a daily basis, basically. So actually, this obviously involves what you do, I would say, as part of your daily job. So what you do in the office, for instance. But it also involve what you do outside of the office. And this is an example that I've given in the talk, you know, when the liaison officers go outside and have a drink and stuff like that, you know. This is also part of what I would call practices. So all the doings that are, I would say, related to a specific craft. So when we talk about police craft, we are talking about specific practices. So I would say that practices are defined in relation to the craft they are associated with. On Brexit, where are we heading? Well, that's a good question. I mean, from the police side, having spoken to a couple of people involved in Brexit, I think the key thing for them at the moment, even if they do think that, you know, this Brexit deal is to a certain extent a complete disaster, I would say. They're kind of trying to look at the replacement for the loss of the Schengen information system. This is, as I see it, this is the main next step. How would you replace the loss of this tool? And so what we see now is that there is a much more involvement of UK law enforcement with Interpol. Interpol used to be kind of, sidelined by UK law enforcement because Interpol is not seen as a brainchild of the UK, if you like. So we see more and more involvement with Interpol, and I was speaking to some of those guys involved in Brexit who was telling me, we're trying to upgrade the Interpol notice system in order for the system to fit much more better to our demands. So my view or my feelings that at some point the Interpol will become, I'm not saying this is becoming a brainchild of the UK, but you will see like a very big imprint of the UK. And so as to where the relation is going, the thing is you need to separate, it's, as I said, it's you need to see the relation between security and politics, but at the same time, you also need to see that on a daily basis on the ground. It doesn't, operational stuff are not defined by political criteria. So they literally don't care about what's happening at the level of politics. And they all say to me, this is it's going to survive. And we understand the stake of the game. We understand the necessity of working together. So the politics can do whatever they want. We just have our job to do on a daily basis. We have to do our job. So I think in that sense, I don't think this is going to be any problem in the future. But thank you again for those questions, Christian. Sarah, your question relation with Bigo. Well, as you know, Didier was my PhD supervisor. So yes, my work extends on his previous work on security professionals, and especially on his work on the fields, basically. And I have to say, there are some similarities between his work and my work, but at the same time, I would say that the big difference between his stuff and mine is that I kind of better conceptualize this field of intelligence cooperation, which has not been done before. But the good thing about his work is that it provides insight on how to develop this, I would say, analysis of intelligence cooperation as a field.
Thank you. No, I didn't know, actually, sorry.
Okay.
But that makes sense, absolutely. Excellent. Okay, are there any other questions from the audience?
We have Maria Sophia.
Sorry, if I may.
Sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I was wondering if you had come across because I understand you were explaining the difference between the traditional and the newcomers when you were talking about the cooperation. And I was wondering if in your research you found that this is really because they cannot fulfill, as you were saying, this sort of like a real policing tasks that you've enumerated, because at Europol, the liaison officers are at Europol, so they're not deployed to the member states. And if you think that's had an effect in the way that they are cooperating, so or is it more that they are not recognized because they are newcomers in the field? So is it more, a matter of how they are cooperating operationally, or is it also because of the ways that Europol is perceived?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, the response is already in your question, and I think it's the issue of the recognition. That's why that's why I was making the distinction between the holders of cooperation, the newcomers. The thing with Europol when it entered this field is that it was not setting up in the virgin environment. So the field was already structured around the bilateral relations between these liaison officers based in European capital cities. So all the stake for Europol, and including Europol, I'm talking about the people within Europol, was to get recognition among, I would say, national services who've been previously working a lot with this EU capital cities based liaison officers. So the key stake was for them to get the recognition. And I think this is something that we still see today in the fact that Europol is still struggling to impose itself better in relation to these already established actors. And this is an ongoing struggle, if you like, especially because if you take, for instance, the case of counter-terrorism. Counter-terrorism has been always structured around bilateral relations or by or through the relation between liaison officers and their local counterparts. So when Europol tried to claim competences over, for instance, counter-terrorism, it became really, really difficult for it to, have some sort of strong position. And this is something that we still see today. So I think that the issue of recognition is what actually makes the difference between the newcomers and, I would say, the heroes of the field.
Thank you.
Any other question? Yes, Joanna?
Now we can't hear you.
Okay, maybe in the meantime, as we wait for Joanna to reconnect, I was very interested in what you said about now the UK becoming very interested in working more closely with Interpol and perhaps, I suppose, further developing Interpol. So what do you think are the challenges there? Like, is that a great development, or do you think that there are potential problems with a greater involvement with Interpol?
I think from a law enforcement perspective, I think it's the Interpol is, they say, okay, we have to deal with Interpol because we lost SIS2, but at the same time, this is not a great, fallback position, because obviously Interpol is much lower than the SIS2. There's also another implication in the fact that when you have like UK police officers doing checks on the street, when they do checks, they do not have direct access to Interpol. So they do, if they're, let's say, looking for someone, they need to make a manual request to the Interpol system. So it's much more longer, much more cumbersome that the EU mechanism of SIS2. And so, it is a solution to them because they've lost SIS2, but at the same time, it's not the greatest one. And obviously, some of them were even telling me, oh, we still have the hope to get back to SIS2. But at the same time, SIS2 is only reserved for EU member states. And now the UK is a third country. So perhaps we'll see in the future the UK government or the UK executive, I don't know, trying to enter some negotiation as to how to get access to SIS2. It wouldn't surprise me. Literally not, because I need to say that the UK is, in terms of security, they're kind of, I would say, aggressive, but they like to, take the lead and make sure things, I would say, move on according to their own interests.
Thank you. But yeah, I agree. I think that once you are no longer a member state, you are a third country. So it would be very difficult to see arrangements that the EU doesn't do with third countries. I'm not sure why they would make them with the UK, but that would be very interesting to see. Any other questions or comments? And it seems we have lost Joanna. Perhaps she will manage to reconnect.
I can ask another question if nobody else wants. We can wait for another minute or for a second at least, if somebody wants to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll ask you something speculative because, we need to see what the future might be. And I don't know whether you've come across this whole Kanchuk idea. Kanchuk is this idea that around the kind of Five Eyes cooperation, except for the US, there could be a new geopolitical actor that could be created that would involve the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. That's the Kanchuk, that's the abbreviation of those names. So except for the US, because there's probably a recognition that the US is too big to be part of that, but a kind of idea around that maybe Four Eyes cooperation, that there could be a new type of union being created and so on. So I'm kind of then wondering, well, one, how realistic do you see that as a geopolitical vision? But two, and that's more intriguing, would be how this intelligence idea could be driving the geopolitics. So it's not the geopolitics driving intelligence, it would be intelligence driving the geopolitics. So I'm kind of wondering what you think of that notion.
All right. Yeah, the Kanzug, I remember. That's a tricky question that I haven't. I'll be frank, I haven't looked into that element. What I can say from my understanding of what's going on at the moment is that with the EU, I mean the UK, sorry, leaving the EU, I mean Britain is kind of losing this kind of gateway to EU intelligence, because the UK was seen as a sort of in between those Anglo-Saxon countries and European intelligence. And so the speculation a couple of years ago was that perhaps some countries would like to, I would say, replace the UK in this position. For instance, you have like France or even Sweden, who could now make this, I would say, transition between the Anglo-Saxon world and European intelligence. But at the same time, I don't know to what extent this is, I don't know to what extent this is true, because this world of intelligence sharing, of signaling intelligence, is pretty much disconnected from the EU to a certain extent. So I don't think this is going to change a lot. And in terms of the Kanzuk, I need to be honest, I have no idea really. I mean, I was just more kind of focused on the EU side, I need to say. But I mean, my understanding, and also my understanding from practice, is that I don't think this will change a lot, Christian, honestly. I mean, I don't think that, I mean, I can see intelligence driving geopolitics for sure. This is not, that wouldn't surprise me. But the reverse, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting point. Are there any other question or comment? If not, then I guess all is left is to say a big thank you to our presenter today. So that was a really fascinating talk, and thank you to Christian for his comments and questions, and thank you to all of you for attending. And I don't know, Christian, if you had any announcement or anything you wanted to say before we close the seminar.
Just a big thank you as well. I hope that we can do a number of these events in the future. It was a great pleasure to have you with us. It was a fascinating talk. Just to mention that we're also thanking Erasmus Plus that has been financing a lot of these activities, both for the Jean Monnet Network on counter-terrorism, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, Jean Monnet module on hybrid warfare, EU resilience on hybrid warfare. So a number of different activities that we have at the university, and that we will be following up on some of those activities at the end of April. We have another big talk. Let me just get out the precise time. It is, if you find it quicker than me, go ahead. Yeah. So on Monday, the 26th of April at 4 o'clock, we have Dr. Charlotte Heath-Kelly from the University of Warwick, who's going to talk about her European Research Council project. That will be followed by a roundtable that involves, of course, Professor Sarah Leonard, myself, and Dr. James Fitzgerald, and Professor Christoph Weller from the University of Augsburg. So we have a nicely balanced roundtable that will then also be chaired by Dr. Jonathan de Dos Pereira. And I hope that I will see you all there again. We will have future events even beyond that. So please stay tuned, and looking forward to have you all back in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.